I'm part of a writing group that meets once a month. We typically meet on a Saturday afternoon, and we spend several hours hanging out and discussing ideas, talking about problems we've been having, and helping each other with feedback from reading each other's stuff. On the holiday months, which in our case is typically meant October and December, we try to make the meeting a bit more festive, and it becomes more of a party than anything else. And that's why when Colby suggested we do an overnight camping trip this October, and complete with a spooky ghost tour and scary stories around the campfire, it sounded like a great idea that was more an expansion of what we normally would have done around Halloween, rather than any real departure from the past 4 years I had been a part of the group. I was excited for it, not just because the activities seemed like they would be fun, but because these people were my friends. Sure, we didn't see each other as often as some friends, but I feel like I've gotten to know each of the 5 other members of our group pretty well over time, and I've reached the point that I look forward to our meetings more for the social aspect, more than any help or support it gives my writing. So last Saturday, we gathered up at Colby's house and headed out in his SUV to Winter Falls Wildlife Preserve. Colby said that he knew one of the guys that administered the property, and we had the green light to be there, which was cool for 2 reasons. The first, only a handful of people were given permission to camp on the property each year, so the likelihood of running into loud drunk teenagers camping too close for comfort was very low. And second, there was an old abandoned place in the land that was rumored to be haunted. Now I assume that the second thing was likely bullshit, and if it had come from Alan or Janet, our 2 paranormal writers in the group, I would have said they were just making up stuff as part of some elaborate Halloween story or a prank. But all of this information had come from Colby, and he didn't like horror. He couldn't stomach it, really. He mainly wrote poetry and character pieces that were so dense with historical detail that you felt like you had been through a class on the given period before you reached the end of the story. He was sensitive and delicate, and well, it seemed odd that he would be the one to suggest going here in the first place, but it somehow made it more believable too. We rode with Colby onto the property, past 2 gates that he had the keys for, and up a winding dirt road that finally petered out into patchy grass and a hard scrabble, before being consumed by brush and deeper woods. I made the suggestion that we should just camp in the open area near the car, but Bonnie and Susan, who were both allegedly romance novelists, but who spent more time flirting with Colby than working on their own writing during our get-togethers, giggled to each other and suggested Colby that we needed to go deeper to find the right spot. I rolled my eyes and I sighed as he awkwardly smiled at them and nodded. Although it hadn't been said, Colby was the de facto leader on this little trip, and without another word, we pushed into the woods. After the initial few feet, the walk actually became fairly pleasant. There was a cool breeze in the afternoon air, and a small crooked path that opened up as we went past the first few trees and bushes. We walked for probably 30 minutes before coming to a clearing that Colby said was a good spot to set up camp. Looking at his watch, he said if we could get our tents and stuff set up quickly, we would have around an hour of daylight left to start heading towards the haunted building that he had started telling us about. He told us that at one time, it had been a private home owned by a family known for their strange ways and practices. He said this last part with a theatricality that I hadn't known he was capable of, raising his eyebrows as he lowered his voice to a gravelly rasp. Eventually the family died off or something, because it became an orphanage of sorts, taking in the troubled children that were having a difficult time at home, or at other orphanages that couldn't or wouldn't tolerate their behavior. Are you saying this was a baby prison? By this time, we were actually walking with him away from the finished campsite, and I regretted the question as soon as I had asked it. I liked Colby, and I didn't want him to think I was making fun of his weird attempt at a scary story, but he just nodded and he grinned at me. Kinda, yeah. Not babies, but some of the children were very violent or deranged. That lasted a few years, but it seems like a lot of the children got worse living at the orphanage, not better. and eventually the place fell into such ill repute that business dried up and the house was shuttered for good. Since that time, no one has lived there, but there are several accounts of people hiking or camping nearby and having incidents. Again, the raised eyebrows, he looked around at us like an old vaudeville villain. It was kind of cute in a dopey way. Bonnie tittered at him. "What kind of incidents, Colby Poo?" That was one of her coined nicknames for him when she was feeling especially whorish. Like usual, he blushed when she said it, looking away before continuing. I wanted to punch her. Well, hearing voices when nobody is there for one thing, and more than one account of seeing lights or faces at the windows of the old house, and that kind of stuff. Susan, not wanting to be left out, grabbed his arm dramatically as she looked up at him with doe eyes. "This sounds scary. Are you going to protect us?" Colby gave an awkward laugh and he nodded. "Yeah, sure." He looked up at me and he smiled. "I'm sure we'll all get through it okay." The house was impressive and impressively creepy. Large swaths of moth lay draped across most of the roof, but even with several of the windows broken and its weathered skin of yellow paint and warped rotting wood, you could see what a beautiful house it once had been. 4 stories tall, with thin columns going up to a large balcony on the second floor. It looked far too stately and regal to be stuck in the middle of these dark woods being slowly consumed by decay. Yet at the same time, it somehow seemed to fit its locale perfectly. The front of the house reminded me of a face. An ancient, moldering face, and that stared at us with cold contempt as we shuffled across what had likely once been a well-manicured front lawn. I suppressed a shiver as I unconsciously dropped my gaze. Looking back at Alan and Janet, I saw they had similar expressions of both awe and apprehension. I leaned toward them and I tried to sound nonchalant. "This place is up to snuff, spookiness-wise. It seemed to be pretty creepy to me, but I'm no expert." Janet looked at me and she beamed. "Yeah, this place is badass." Alan nodded his agreement before going back to fumbling with his phone as he tried to take a picture. And Colby noticed him and he frowned. "Come on, man, leave off with the phone, will you? We're here to experience it, not look at our phone screens the entire time." Looking sheepish, Alan nodded and stuffed his phone back into his pocket. I almost said something then, as I didn't like Colby bossing Alan around like he was some kid. Especially in truth, Alan was probably 5 years older than any of the rest of us. But then Colby was excitedly telling us to come on, that he had a key for this place too, and I went along, pushing my irritation and doubts aside. He unlocked the front door without any problem, but it took him and Alan shoving it hard to create a large enough opening for us to squeeze through. The afternoon light had already been fading, and once we were inside, I realized that we had left the sun behind. We all pulled out our phones then, using the flashlight apps to light our way as we moved down a trash-strewn front hall that led to a large room that had possibly once been a small ballroom or a massive parlor. Now, it was a black ruin. A tangy, putrid smell filled my nose as I sent a wash of electric light over moldy walls and dangerous-looking floors. I don't know about this, Colby. Now, I didn't want to be a party pooper, but I was already having images of someone falling through the floor, or getting sick from breathing in all of this rot. I could see that Alan and Janet were feeling the same way, and even Susan was starting to get uncomfortable. I noticed Bonnie scowling at me, but I ignored her as I went on. I'm just worried this place might not be structurally sound, you know? I just don't want somebody getting hurt. He nodded and he smiled. I know it looks rough, but listen. I've been here once before and it's really safer than it looks. Just go where I go, and if anybody gets too worried, we'll stop and leave. Fair enough? I wanted to say that I had already said I was too worried and wanted to go, but I let it go. I was probably being overly cautious. and as long as we were careful, it should be fine. And it was, at least at first. The house was very creepy and we heard the odd sound or two, but there was nothing too remarkable. After walking around inside for a few minutes, we split up into smaller groups to explore a bit. Surprising no one, Bonnie and Susan had gone with Colby while I had gone with Alan and Janet. I didn't like splitting up, but I was trying to not worry and get into the spirit of our adventure. We spent some time wandering around the main floor, as I had no interest in trying the stairs or the flooring on the upper levels. This house was truly massive, with numerous halls weaving between different rooms, large and small. Alan, Janet, and I finally started working our way back towards the front of the house, when I turned a corner and I ran into Susan. The odd bubblegum scented perfume she always wore assaulting my nostrils as we bumped into each other. She let out a yelp and then smiled nervously at me. Shit, I got turned around and separated from Colby and Bonnie. I'm glad to see a friendly face again in this place. I smiled and then I winced slightly. Poor Colby. Bonnie has probably attacked him by now. Susan surprised me by letting out a short laugh and nodding. Yeah, I think he's cute and all, but not really my type. I just like joking around a bit. But Bonnie, yeah, she may hurt that boy. We both laughed again, trying to stifle it as Alan and Janet came around the corner. We walked on for a bit when I thought I heard Bonnie's voice. Thinking about what we had just said, I decided that I might as well try to intervene, if Colby wanted any intervening. I dropped back and I went in the direction of her voice, making a point to call out to them well before I walked up on something I shouldn't see. I got no response, and as I walked to where I thought she should have been, I saw no sign of either of them. I was in what once had been a large kitchen. White tile walls painted with blue roosters, forming a weirdly quaint procession around the perimeter of the room. There was an old-fashioned kitchen hearth containing a large cast-iron pot along one wall, and as I watched, I thought I saw shadowed movement in the ashes underneath the pot. My first thought was rat, but whatever it was, I wanted no part of it. I headed back the way that I came, regretting ever leaving the group in the first place. That's when I rounded another corner and I saw Bonnie and Colby. At first I thought they were embracing, but then I realized that he was behind her, and she didn't seem to realize that he was even there. His light was off and I could only make out his outline from the reflected illumination of her phone's light, hitting the rotting wall in front of them. It struck me as odd, so I stopped and I watched for a moment. Colby lifted his hand and placed it on the back of her head, while uttering a single word. Selah. Bonnie jumped and let out a little scream as she turned around. I couldn't see much of their faces in the phone's meager glow, but I could hear the fear in her voice as she spoke, although she did try to hide it and turn it into a joke when she saw who had touched her. You scared me, you asshole. You're gonna have to make that up too. Hey, you guys ready to go? I don't know why I blurted it out, but I didn't want to be in the house any longer, and for whatever reason, I didn't feel like leaving Bonnie alone with him anymore. I expected a glare from Bonnie as I shined my light on them, but instead she looked relieved. For Colby's part, he just gave me a thin smile and he nodded. Yeah, I think we're done here. We were all fairly quiet on the way back to the campsite, though I noticed that neither Bonnie or Susan seemed interested in sticking close to Colby this time. I didn't know what to make of what I had seen, and as we settled into cooking hot dogs and joking around, things began to feel normal again. By the time we were taking turns telling scary stories, I had almost decided that I had just made a mistake thinking anything was going on beyond a guy trying to scare a girl that he liked. But when I was getting closer to my turn to tell a story, I got up to go to the bathroom as I racked my brain for something that could even vaguely compete with Janet's story, about her mother's dead twin sister or Alan's tale of water babies that dragged people into a nearby lake. I found what I hoped was a non-poisonous bush and I squatted down. My gaze going back to the campfire and my odd collection of friends laughing and talking there. Their shadows were flung giant against the tents and surrounding trees, dancing and shifting in the ever-changing flicker of the firelight. And that's when I noticed it. Bonnie had two shadows. One was like the others, vague and ill-defined, but still an amplified and distorted version of her silhouette. The second was something very different. It was much darker and it almost seemed to have a substance to it. It moved, but in a way that was discordant and wrong, out of sync with the fire or the other shadows. And its shape was more defined than the others and much more horrible because of that added definition. I didn't know what it was, but it didn't resemble anything human. I pulled up my pants and I strode back to the camp. My heart was thudding, and the last thing that I wanted was to be near either Colby or Bonnie. But he had the only car and I wasn't staying out there any longer. I told him that I was sick, badly sick, and that I needed to go home. Alan and Janet made disappointed noises, and Bonnie and Susan gave no real argument or comment at anything other than Susan asking if I needed anything. But my eyes were primarily on Colby. He just looked at me, his expression seeming sad or disappointed except for his eyes. His eyes were hard and distant, as though he was considering something, and doing some kind of dark arithmetic behind that gaze. After a few heartbeats, he just nodded with a small smile. Sure, there's always next time. The ride back to his house was the longest 3 hours of my life. I was exhausted, but there was no chance I was falling asleep in the car with either of them. While I didn't know what was going on, I was past doubting myself for putting myself in any more danger than it was necessary to get home and away from them. So I sat in the back with my hand on the door handle, in case I needed to make a hasty exit, a fast-moving asphalt or no. I talked very little, and when we reached Colby's house, I was out of the car before it made a complete stop. Someone yelled that I was leaving my sleeping bag behind, but I didn't turn around. Screw it, they could keep it. When I got home, I locked my door and I checked all of my windows. It was after sunrise before I finally fell into a fitful sleep. And even then, I was plagued with dreams of being trapped in that house with shadows chasing me through the dark. In the past few days after that, I kept expecting to see Colby or Bonnie or both, coming around to check on me or deal with me or something. But there had been no sign of anyone. I have stayed in my apartment most of the time since, but this afternoon I finally had to go out and get groceries. I was nervous the entire time, but I never saw anybody that I knew, and I made it back home uneventfully. Yet when I walked into my apartment, I froze. Bubblegum. I smelled bubblegum. I dropped my bags and I stepped back into the hallway. After several seconds of silence, I reached in enough to turn on all the lights I could get from the switches next to the door. Nothing seemed out of place, and there was no sign of anyone. My heart thudding, I picked up one of my grocery bags containing several weighted cans and I began to explore my apartment with the makeshift weapon. There was nothing there. Well, except for a singular smell of that bubblegum perfume in several spots throughout. I locked the door back and I went to sit down on my laptop to write this all out, when something made me stop and go to my window. I had gotten into the habit of frequently looking outside the last few days, always wary of some sign of Colby or Bonnie, but there had never been anybody out there. Until now. Across the street on the far sidewalk, I saw Susan and Alan standing together holding hands and staring up at me. That was 5 hours ago and they're still there. They haven't tried to come in or communicate with me, but they also haven't moved from their spot in all that time. They just stand and stare, waiting, waiting for me to give up and come out so they can get me for something. And while I don't understand enough to know exactly what they want to do with me, I have a strong suspicion. I think they want to take me camping again.